Colleagues, good evening and welcome to the inaugural lecture of the Carmichael Lecture, and what an honour it is to be here today as your MC. I'm Karina Haythorpe, the Federal President of the Australian Education Union, and as we begin tonight, I would love to welcome Wurundjeri woman Emma Mildenhall for the Welcome to Country. Thank you, Emma.
That was quick, it caught me a little off guard. Thank you very much to Karina for introducing me here this evening. Hi, my name is Emma Mildenhall from the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation. I would like to say welcome to everyone in Woiwurrung language, Wominjeka Wurundjeri Balak Yiman Kundibi, meaning welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. I am a proud and passionate Aboriginal woman. My tribe is Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, being Melbourne's CBD and surrounding country. We are a part of the Kulin Nation, which consists of the 5 following tribes: Wurundjeri, Wathaurong, Tanarong, Boonwurrung and Dja Dja Wurrung. I would like to pay my respect to my ancestors, also to elders past, present and emerging. I would like to acknowledge any and all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here attending this evening, and I would like to pay my respects to your elders. It is through their hard work that I definitely believe has allowed me to live a better life as an Aboriginal person today. I would also like to acknowledge all people here attending this evening from all backgrounds, and I would like to pay my respect to you. I would also like to echo Karina's acknowledgement to be of dignitaries here attending, and thank you for your work in working with us and helping create opportunities in the name of reconciliation. My Aboriginal ancestry is Uncle William Barrack and his sister Annie Borat. Uncle William being the last Narrangetta for the Wurundjeri tribe, which is the last tribal leader. He has an amazing story as well. My grandmother, Martha Margaret Nicholson, Nana's maiden name prior to marriage being Terrick, was delivered by her grandmother, Jemima, on Corandurk Aboriginal Mission near Hillsville. My great-great-grandmother taught my grandmother the importance of family, culture and caring for one another. My auntie Patricia Ockwell is the eldest sibling, and my mother, Georgina Nicholson, is the youngest. I'm so grateful to be here this evening and welcome everyone to country. Country here being Naarm meaning Melbourne. Aboriginal people have lived off this land, including hunting and gathering, and cared for country for a very long time, being the oldest continuing living culture. Australia's traditional owners. We have a strong connection to the land and waters and a strong passion to care for it, and we view country as all connecting and water as the life source of country. It's so important to look after our waterways. Prior to settlement, we had practices to care for country that are still relevant today, and my people are active today, such as being a part of fire-prone areas, waterways protection, along with restoring waterways. Caring for country is for everyone. It's not only an obligation and a right, but it's also an absolute privilege. I wish everyone the very best here this evening. Thank you all very much for having me a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your welcome to country, and I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land, a land of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to the elders of this land, past and present, and also to acknowledge all people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background in our audience today. It's our privilege to walk together and to learn together on country, and so we thank you very much for your welcome. Colleagues, we're joined today by around 300 guests in the theatre, perhaps a few less now, given some of the COVID situations that are playing out around the country. But we know we've got many more who are joining us by Zoom for the inaugural lecture of the Carmichael Centre. The Carmichael Centre is a centre that's been set up to continue research and education work in the spirit of Laurie Carmichael, the former leader of the Metalworkers Union and the ACTU. And unfortunately, some of the advisory committee members have been unable to join us in person, and I'd just like to acknowledge their commitment to our work before we begin. because I'm sure they're watching online. So a big shout out to Doug Cameron, our chair, to Laurie Carmichael Jr., to Don Sutherland and Andrew Detmar. I'd now like to invite Vice-Chancellor and President of RMIT University, Professor Alec Cameron, to speak. Welcome.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Emma, for your welcome to country. I'd also like to acknowledge our esteemed keynote speaker and guest, Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Joe Stiglitz, who of course you've all come to listen to. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege as Vice-Chancellor and President of RMIT University to welcome you all to the Capitol. This iconic Burley Griffin designed theatre was recently restored to become once again one of the city's most extraordinary venues and a place of hands-on learning for our creative students. So we are proud indeed to be your host for this inaugural Laurie Carmichael Lecture. As a university founded on a promise to empower working people, raise their voices and prepare them for the world of work, we share a natural connection with the legacy of Laurie Carmichael. And this lecture series is part of an ongoing collaboration between RMIT and the Carmichael Centre within the Australian Institute, built on a shared belief that research should generate positive social impact. A belief that I believe is shared by our co-participants at this evening's event, the Victorian Government and the Department of Education and Training, as well as the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union and the Australian Education Union. Before I close, I'd like to thank distinguished Professor Anthony Forsyth from RMIT, who was instrumental in securing our wonderful keynote speaker for this evening's lecture. I personally look forward to hearing the insights of Professor Stiglitz, but I also look forward very much to our future support for this important annual series. Thank you all.
We now would like to share with you a short video about Laurie Carmichael.
We can then say truly and justifiably that education and training, that learning is no longer the province of an elite privileged section of our community, but is the right, responsibility and opportunity of all working people within our country.
Laurie was a giant of the Australian trade union movement. He was a working class intellectual, he was an educator, and he was respected by everyone who ever dealt with him.
Laurie Carmichael was not only a dedicated union believer, but he fundamentally believed in the importance of high quality vocational education at TAFE as crucial for the workers and for the economy and for a healthy labour market.
He was a very passionate person, and that passion showed through his speaking at public meetings, where everybody would often comment on just how passionate he was on his feelings.
I think one of the great recognitions of Laurie was that the more conservative forces in the trade union movement embraced Laurie as a significant figure in Australia. And regardless of him being a member of the Communist Party until his death, he probably had more influence on workers' wages, conditions, technology, and lives than any other union official ever in this country.
And Marx's conception of socialism was that it would be and create the most democratic type of society known to mankind.
In 1969, I refused to register and be conscripted for the Vietnam War. I was jailed for 2 weeks, and in the process my mother was dragged across the ground by police and my father arrested by the police for coming to her aid. My father was very involved and interested in many things, and particularly on research He took a year off when he was with the metal workers to be a research officer and to read the latest economics and political literature at the time so he could develop strategy that would help him win into the future. But he took a whole year off from being a union organizer, trying to understand what was the situation at the time, how to learn from the latest in terms of economics and political strategy and develop it and use it for the future.
You know, Laurie's legacy in this place is really ensuring for us that we can build that deeper understanding of the collective power of unions and the importance of building that just civil and progressive society for all.
Mighty and fearless leader of the trade union movement, who we are very proud to stand alongside, Sally McManus.
Thank you, Karina. Also, want to acknowledge country as well and say that the ACTU supports Uluru's statement from the heart. It's great to be here to launch the first Laurie Carmichael Lecture by the Carmichael Centre. The ACTU, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, the Australian Education Union are very happy to be the funding partners for the Carmichael Centre, which is hosted at the Centre for Future Work. The Centre honours Laurie Carmichael's life and ongoing legacy. The truth is, I'm sure many people in this audience would not be aware of Laurie's extraordinary contribution as a trade unionist. So I want to start by saying a few words about Laurie and why our movement chose to honour him with this research centre. Laurie Carmichael was a visionary, he was an intellectual, he was an organiser, he was a change maker, he was a communist, as you just heard, and a trade unionist through and through. Laurie was part of a long and proud tradition of working class intellectuals who found voice, their community, in the collective power of the trade union movement. They used that power to transform Australia for the better. Laurie Carmichael started at the Williamson Naval Dockyards, which I do believe is only 5 kilometres away from here. And there he joined the Amalgamated Engineering Union, a forerunner of today's AMWU. He was elected as his union's Melbourne District Secretary in 1958, and in 1972 became the National Assistant Secretary in the newly formed Amalgamated Metalworkers Union. He was elected as ACTU Assistant Secretary in 1987. But his influence didn't derive from his impressive list of titles. Laurie was completely dedicated to rank and file union organising and to action, to support and educate union delegates. His union was a member-led union, and it was his direct connection to his members which was a true source of Laurie's influence. His union was famous for winning advances in pay and conditions that would flow on to other sections of the workforce. I do wonder whether that's the wage price spiral they may be talking about today. This happened against the stubborn resistance, of course, of government and big business. In 1964, the then Minister for Labor, Billy McMahon, said that Carmichael was one of the most evil men in the trade union movement. So coming from Billy McMahon, I think it's more of a compliment than an insult. Laurie was at the forefront of campaigns against the Menzies government's penal powers, the anti-union laws that stopped workers from taking industrial action. Mass worker action in 1969 effectively saw the ending of these laws. Across his career, Laurie directly contributed to countless wage rises and improvements in conditions, including leading the campaign for the 38-hour working week. He was a vital force behind the accord between the ACTU and the ALP government to lead to the epic reforms like Medicare and universal superannuation. I want to acknowledge that Bill Kelty, his partner with this, is here today as well. He was an internationalist. One of his proudest accomplishments was his involvement in the movement against the war in Vietnam. Laurie was there, and this was when it was very much a minority cause and not popular. He recounted his first peace rally in 1965 when there was just 50 people there. In May 1970, more than 100,000 protested in Melbourne for peace in the famed Monitorium March. Laurie was integral to the organising of these protests through his role in the Melbourne Peace Committee. These mass protests, of course, didn't just happen. It required hard work over many years by people such as Laurie, who were willing to build something small into a genuine mass movement. Laurie was a great believer in worker education. He dedicated a significant part of his life to enhancing vocational education and connecting it to the emerging needs of a modern workforce. That is why the AEU is one of the sponsors. The education programs Laurie put together for his union were legendary. They connected theory to practice and empowered workers to take more informed action. He took a great interest in changes in technology and the future of the world of work. He was always future-focused. He saw the future as a site of contest. At a time of massive technological change for his industry, Laurie identified the major threats posed by computerisation, which is a funny word, isn't it? We don't really use that now, digitalisation, and new forms of communication. He also saw the opportunities. He believed that workers needed to be proactive in educating themselves about these technological changes and gaining new skills required to thrive in a future economy. He knew to do this, they needed to be organised in their unions to take action to make sure the changes happened on their terms. They could shape the inevitable change, not just be victims of it. But this required strong unions advancing workers' interests in these times of change. Laurie passed away in August 2018. But his legacy endures and the lessons of his long and remarkable time as a unionist lives on. Tonight, we're so honoured to hear from Professor Joseph Stiglitz about the economic importance of unions. I don't want to steal his thunder, but there are some really fundamental lessons from Laurie's life and activism that we should mention. During his union campaign for the shorter working week, Laurie wrote, "The big business and its political allies said this." He wrote this: "They will try to show that the shorter working hours of work would not be good for the country and that unions are ruining the country." Sound familiar, hey? I was reminded of this recently when the union movement's argument for an increase to the minimum wage resulted in an historic wage increase for a quarter of working people, 5.2% for those on the minimum wage and 4.6% for those relying on award wages. We, of course, were inundated with accusations that we were wrecking the economy and that unions would drive up inflation and ruin the country. The same is happening now for any union who dares ask for a pay rise that keeps up with the cost of living, despite increasing productivity, despite record profits, despite low unemployment, all, of course, to protect capital's profit share. It seems, of course, the more things change, the more they stay exactly the same. Laurie never apologised for taking action to improve the lives of working people, and neither do we today. But he did believe that unionists needed to be educated on economic realities to rebut our opponents who speak of the national interests where really they're talking about self-interest. So it's in Laurie's footsteps today. The union movement ensures that the voices of workers are heard in the debates about Australia's economic future. And we say unapologetically, Australia's future prosperity will be built on supporting workers and their unions. The economy just does not exist just in spreadsheets or shareholders' reports. It's not what first-year economics subject textbooks theorise or what abstract projections would like it to be. The economy is working people wondering how they will make ends meet when interest rates go up but their wages do not. There are powerful economic and political interests in our country who oppose every improvement to workers' lives and conditions by saying it's bad for the economy. And every time we do so, the union movement will stand up to them. We're the creators and the guardians of the workers' rights that allow us to live decent lives outside of work. We are the creators of a new future, of a better future based on growing and a productive economy that is built on decent work and well-paid jobs. An economy that allows working people to pursue their ambitions in the workplace, enjoy their lives outside of work, and be recognised for the contribution that we make to our society. This is the economic, but also the moral case for unionism. And it's by building this better future together that we honour the legacy of Laurie Carmichael. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sally. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. It's my great pleasure to introduce, to deliver the inaugural Laurie Carmichael Lecture, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Welcome. Welcome, Professor. Thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here in Melbourne again, and it's a special pleasure to be giving this inaugural lecture in honor of a great union leader who did so much to increase the living standards, not only of workers, but of all Australians. The topic that I'm going to talk about is the role of unions in the modern economy. And I want to begin, though, with a little bit of historical reference. It's important to remember why unions originated in the first place. Before unions, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, wages actually went down. Working conditions got worse. Any of you read Dickens know how bad working conditions were in the middle of the 19th century in the UK. And this was in a period of what was called the Industrial Revolution, where there were supposed to be, GDP was going up, living standards, incomes were going up, but not for large fractions of the working population. So workers were facing low wages, poor working conditions. Even as recently as the early part of the 20th century, working conditions were terrible. In the United States, they were brought home, how bad conditions were was brought home by the fact that workers were actually locked up in their factories. And there's one event in the United States that stands out is they were locked up and there was a fire and hundreds of people died in the triangle shirt waist fire. And all of that provided impetus not only for unionization, but also for social legislation. But it's always been a struggle. Employers have always resisted. They always wanted to get labor for as lower price as possible. In the early days of the founding of America, the way we got cheap labor was slavery from Africa. That was really cheap labor. We didn't pay them anything, and we exploited them until they died. And that was really how to, when they couldn't get slaves, they tried to have frameworks that made working wages as low as possible. So it's always been this kind of a struggle, and in the United States, the critical moment was after the Great Depression, FDR. We passed the Wagner Act that provided the framework for collective action. And it was only been through the collective action of unions that workers' conditions got better. And the unions really made a very big difference for, and it, in the United States, opened up a world in which we all became middle class, or so we thought. It led to reversal of these terrible conditions that had prevailed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Well, as I said, it was always a struggle. And after the Wagner Act was passed in the United States, employers whittled away at those rights. And they did it in one way or another, including through legislation, especially in states that were where workers did not, were, quite frankly, controlled by Republicans. I know it shouldn't be partisan here, but it is actually the truth. So they got whittled away, and they passed laws like the right to work law. Right to work law wasn't a right to work. Everybody had it was really the right to free ride. It was free. The unions were working to increase living conditions and increase wages, working conditions and increase wages, and it was an attempt to allow workers to benefit from the negotiations of the unions without contributing. But of course, what the unions were providing was a public good for all workers. And in the presence of free riders, we know what happens. You will have an undersupply of these critical services. And that was part of a process of the evisceration of workers' powers, of unions, that led to worse working conditions and lower wages. It was only through collective action that workers were able to improve their well-being. And this is a theme I want to emphasize. In my book, in my recent book, People, Power, and Profits, I talk about the need for collective action in a whole variety of areas, and that need for collective action is even greater in a modern economy. We have to have collective action to provide education, health, research, infrastructure, not only hard infrastructure, but the soft infrastructure related to, say, provision of child care. Collective action in a modern economy is obviously so much more important than it is in a simple primitive economy where people are just farmers. And it's going to become even more important as we move to an innovation economy. Well, one of the things I emphasize in my book is that there are multiple forms of collective action. We often think of government when we think of collective action, but civil society and among the forms of collective action where groups of people get together and work together for a common cause are unions. And so that is, in a way, from a theoretical perspective, the key function of unions in our society. The importance of workers' collective action working together is, if anything, increasing because of the increased concentration of market power. Something I documented in my book, but it's also been documented in a large body of academic literature. And the point is that this increased concentration of market power by corporations means it's even more important to have a countervailing power in the way that Galbraith talked about it, in the form of unions. But just when unions are most needed as a share of the labor force, particularly in the private sector, they become very small, especially in the United States, but in Australia and in many other advanced countries. The consequences is that in the absence of strong unions, what we're seeing is a new form, and in the absence of the political support that unions have for strong government action to protect workers, there are a whole new forms of abuse of workers that have arisen. In the United States, we have the problems of split schedules where people have to work a few hours in the morning, then they get time off, and a few hours in the evening. Making their effective pay very low. They have just-in-time scheduling, so they can't organize their lives, including childcare. Their working conditions where workers in one of the richest companies in America have to stand for hours without being able to sit. And they're getting paid really wages that are unbelievably low. In the United States, because we don't have strong unions, and unions have not been able to push for good legislation, wages at the bottom, adjusted for inflation, are at the same level that they were more than 65 years ago. So can you imagine not having a pay rise in 65 years, and you're watching TV, and a lot of people seem to be doing very well. Even in the middle of the United States, there have not been increases in income adjusted for inflation for more than 4 decades. And if you don't have unions advocating for the well-being of all people, you wind up with healthcare systems where things are so bad that life expectancy in the United States has been on decline even before the pandemic. That the advances, it's not like in the United States we don't have good doctors, we don't understand medical science, but we don't have a system that delivers health to ordinary people. And that is why life expectancy has been on decline. Well, the lack of balance of power in our economy is manifesting itself in many different forms, many different ways. The most striking is what I just emphasized, the increase in inequality in our society, where the top 1% gets 20%, 25% of the income and twice that amount of the wealth. And things have been getting increasingly worse. But it's not just these adverse effects on what it does to our to inequality. It actually hurts our economy. It hurts our democracy. It really divides our society. When foreigners, when people look at America and they say, how could you have somebody like Trump? And you see then what has been happening to the growth of inequality in our society, it becomes more understandable. When you see the fact that those at the bottom have not gotten a pay raise in 65 years, I mean, not that they've worked that long, but over 2 generations, when you realize that this will be, and this is not only in the United States, but in many other countries, this will be the first generation that is worse off than their parents. And what does that do to the nature of a society when there's no hope and that no aspiration? This lack of balance of power has resulted in this growth of inequality which is undermining our democracy, but it's also undermining our economy. It actually leads to lower productivity. It leads to a less well-performing economy. That was one of the central themes of another one of my books called The Price of Inequality. And the title was, chosen because I said we were paying a high price for the high level of inequality that, there's a lot of discussion in many countries, including Australia, of what contributes to productivity. Well, one thing that harms productivity is high levels of inequality. But there are, and in my book, I delineate the variety of channels through which inequality undermines a country's economic performance. When I wrote the book, some people thought this was a little bit of a radical view, but in the decades since I wrote that book, it's now become mainstream. Even the IMF, which for those of you who don't know, it's not a left-wing organization, has said that inequality is bad for economic performance. It leads to lower growth, more volatility. So a country concerned about greater performance ought to be concerned about making sure that there's not this growth of inequality. And the only way that, or at least one of the principal ways in which this growth of inequality can be stymied is through a better balance of power, and that means stronger unions. But unions play a role in an increase in productivity in another way. It gives voice to workers in the workplace. And workers are the people who have actually the best information about what is going on in the workplace. And by giving them greater voice, one has the possibility of increasing productivity. It's part of the reason why, looking at one part of one sector of our economy, Massachusetts is the state, a state in the United States where teachers' unions are particularly influential, particularly powerful. And it is the state which has the best performing education system. And I don't think it's an accident. It is partly, it's not in spite of the unions, it's because of the unions, because the unions become a very strong advocate for strong investments in education and designing an education system that delivers. Well, the irony, in a way, is that the success of unions, especially through the political process, has actually weakened unions. And I know that's very frustrating for people in the union movement, but it is precisely because in places where they've been successful, people will say, well, we don't need it. We have good working conditions. What do we need unions for? It's a little bit like what happened in banking in the United States. In early 1980s, under Ronald Reagan, the Republicans said, we haven't had a banking crisis for 50 years. What do we need financial regulations? What do we need banking regulations for? And of course, the reason we hadn't had a financial crisis for 50 years is because we had financial regulations. And it's remarkable. It wasn't very long after we got rid of the, even reduced the financial regulation, that we had our first financial crisis in 1989, just a few years, within the term of one president. And then it was just a little bit later than that we had the global financial crisis, or what you call here the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008. So it's very much the same way. When you have institutions that are working, you take them for granted, and then you say, well, what do we need them for? But it was precisely because we have those institutions that are delivering on those basic goods that we have those kinds of benefits, those higher living standards. Well, not surprisingly, as union power has decreased, there have been these reversals of the gains that I described before. And what makes it even more difficult is that at the same time that the political power of unions has been weakened, economic conditions have also been made life more difficult for unions. And I think the union movement has to recognize this and come to terms with it. So it's easier to unionize when you have large enterprises, big companies, manufacturing enterprises, or big companies. But we are evolving towards a service sector and innovation economy, and this average size of the establishments in that kind of service sector economy is smaller, and that's going to make unionization more difficult, but not impossible, as many of you know. I mean, there are some unions here that are unions of service sector workers. And one of the strongest unions in the United States is the SEIU, and so it is possible, and in fact, I would say it's even more important for there to be unionization. And the reason is pretty clear, that workers are their bargaining power is even weaker in these contexts. And the platforms, as an example, like Uber, have really weakened the power of workers. Their working conditions in many ways are worse than ordinary, old-fashioned taxi cab drivers. The arguments you will hear from Uber, from the other platforms, is the drivers are independent contractors. They're working for themselves. And that argument that they're independent contractor has been as an excuse for not giving them any benefits. No sick leave, not contributing to retirement benefits, no health benefits, leaving them really bereft. And it's an argument not against even the minimum wage. After all, they're just independent contractors. In New York City, the Taxicab Commission did a study of what was the effective wage that Uber drivers were getting. And one of the interesting things about the platforms is you can monitor more easily what was going on, because you can see when they're on the platform, and you can see when they're looking for a job and what their income is. The average wage of our taxicab drivers was about $6 an hour. The result of this is it was actually dangerous, because in order to make a barely livable income, they had to drive for 12, 14, 15 hours a day, and at that point they were dangerous. So it's a question of the health and safety, not only of the drivers, but those who are being driven. Well, the fact that it is a platform doesn't change the fact that there is abuse of workers. But it may make organizing the workers more difficult. It makes it more important to argue for them. But now, just one more anecdote I want to talk about why it's so important is illustrated by what happened in COVID-19, where the workers, the frontline workers, had to go to work and were exposed to the disease. And as you all know, and it's true not only in the United States but in other countries, lower income people were not only more exposed, they had poorer health conditions, and especially in the United States because we don't have a public health system, and they died in much larger numbers, and they got the disease in larger numbers. And we had legislation that should have protected them. We have an Office of Health and Safety in the workplace. But unfortunately, this was during the Trump administration. They didn't believe in government protecting workers. And so they didn't do anything to make sure that workers had protective gear, were socially distanced, wore masks. They didn't do anything. And not surprisingly, in some contexts where people were particularly close together, like meatpacking, they died in record numbers. But in places like New York, where you had strong unions, the unions came in and said, say in the context of butchers, in grocery stores, and said, you have to give us masks, allow us to be socially distanced. They stepped in where the government should have been and protected workers from the ravages of the disease. And this is just one illustration, but a very dramatic one of the kind of role that unions have to play, particularly when government isn't playing the role that it should be. But these are issues where clearly unions have to take a political role because they should be protecting not only their own workers, but advocating to make sure that all workers are protected. Well, as I say, it's going to be a greater challenge going forward to make sure that workers are organized, because the marketplace is going to be more fragmented. And I think it's possible, and some of the most successful unions have succeeded in doing that. I think it's even more important, as I say, that strengthen unionization because of the growing imbalance of power. Well, that leads me to the final set of remarks I want to make, which is, what is the agenda that might redress some of these imbalances that I've described? And this is actually a very exciting time to be in Australia, because you just elected a Labor government. So the question is, what should you ask of your Labor government? The title of the party, Labor, suggests that it should be working for ordinary Australians, including workers. So I hope that they are open to what is required is actually a very comprehensive agenda. And I'm just going to be able to, in the few minutes, list a number of things that ought to be done. I think there are actually a lot of things. I mean, things have been going bad for a very long time, and you're not going to be able to remedy them in 1 or 2 years. but one should have a vision of what kinds of things that one would like and that you should demand of your labor government. Well, obviously, we're talking about unions, and the first place to begin is reform of industrial labor relations law, what we call labor law. And there are many aspects of this, and I don't feel like I'm an expert on Australian labor law, but I know a lot about American labor law and about some things about European labor law. I've written with a group in Europe, a progressive, called the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, a book called Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, and we, with the Roosevelt Institute, we did a book called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, and we devoted some time to the issue of labor law. And two basic issues that I think have to be addressed. The first is the nature of bargaining. What can be bargained for, and how does bargaining occur? Having sectoral bargaining, sometimes called here, I guess, pattern bargaining, rather than individual enterprises just bargaining, is an important way of increasing the bargaining power of workers. And one of the ways you know that is the resistance that employers give to it. If it didn't have any effect on bargaining power, they say, okay, go ahead. If you want that, fine. But the fact that they've put up such resistance, and not only in Australia and New Zealand and Europe, in Germany, is evidence, I think, that there is at least a very strong case that it would change the nature of what comes out of the bargaining process. So that's an example of where industrial relations, the bargaining process needs to be changed. Other examples of what you can bargain for. You know, it's not just wages and working conditions. It's voice. It's voice in the workplace. You know, there are lots of other things that are important to workers that ought to be the subject, allowed to be part of bargaining. In fact, you know, workers wouldn't be using scarce capital, bargaining capital, if they didn't think it was important. So what is interesting is some of the neoliberals, people who don't believe in regulations, somehow have wound up believing in regulations against workers. Why, if they believe that free markets work, why don't they let workers and firms bargain freely? But obviously they're trying to, let's make clear, regulation, the deregulation movement wasn't about deregulation. It was about changing the regulatory environment to advantage some interest at the expense of others. It wasn't really about deregulation. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. So one set of issues clearly that has to be addressed is the framework of bargaining and what can be bargained for. But a second really important set of thing is all the rules that affect organizing workers. That one of the things that have been very, very clever about the right is that they understand transaction costs, they understand all the things that make it difficult to organize. And so rather than saying we're not going to allow unions, they whittle away at the ability to unionize. And it's just very slow whittling away. Again, I don't know all the details. I've had a lot of interesting conversations while I've been here in Australia. But I've seen it in the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States, in a couple of amazing decisions. I mean, there have been even more amazing decisions about Roe versus Wade the restraints on guns and delegation of authority to the EPA on environment. But they've also made, not gotten as much attention, a number of decisions about unionization. One of them was that migrant workers are really treated, I've described how bad things are. Among the workers who are the most badly treated are migrant workers. And migrant workers typically live in housing provided by their employer. Housing is really an overly elegant word to describe the conditions under which they live. But they live in accommodations, barracks, or whatever you want to call them. Well, they work and they live on this property, and the question is, can unions get access to the workers? And you would say, okay, they may not interfere with the work, but certainly when their workers are in the barracks, or what do you call their accommodations, they should be able to, the union organizers should be able to talk to them. And the Supreme Court said, no, private property, as we define it, says they have the right to stop any union organizer coming anywhere on their property, which is basically makes it impossible to organize migrant workers. So that's a Supreme Court decision that is going to be very difficult to reverse unless we do something about our Supreme Court. Another example is they said that the obligation of workers to join a union or pay for a union in the public for the pay a contribution for the bargaining that public sector unions did was unconstitutional because it violated the right to free speech, the First Amendment. Now you scratch your head and you say, how does that violate the right to free speech? You have to understand the Supreme Court reasons backwards. They wanted to find an argument of how they could stop unionization in the public sector. And they came up with this argument using the First Amendment. It is really mind-boggling where they've gone. But that has made it much harder for public sector unions to be organized. So these are two examples, two categories of reforms that I'm sure, I've seen in every country. Part of the neoliberal agenda was to weaken bargaining power and weaken the ability of unions to get together to organize. And that needs to be reversed. A second area that is just getting attention in the United States is the role of competition laws. And competition laws, one thinks of mainly affecting corporations. But the firms have figured out how to engage in anti-competitive practices to weaken the bargaining power of workers, to weaken competition for workers, and then drive down their wages. One example of that is Apple was part of a ringleader to drive down the wages of their engineers who were the source of Apple's success. And you would have thought they would be thankful for the brilliance of their engineers. And the way they showed their gratitude was to make an agreement with all the other companies in Silicon Valley who hired these very advanced technical engineers to keep their wages, not to compete with each other. But that's at the high end. At the low end, many fast food companies have non-compete clauses that if you work for McDonald's, you can't quit and work for Burger King. Now, the origins of non-compete clauses had something to do with worrying about stealing intellectual property. And people are scratching their head, what is the intellectual property in McDonald's that Burger King doesn't know about? This is nothing but an attempt to suppress wages, to increase the monopsony power of firms. And so one of the things that Biden has been very committed to doing more about competition, and this is one of the areas, but one needs to be very diligent in this area. A third area is corporate governance laws. I think it's important for workers to have seats on the board of directors. There needs to be a voice for workers when firms shut down a plant or when they, it's not that it's the only voice, but it needs to be a voice that is heard. And it's not a panacea, it's not going to solve all problems, but having the voice of workers, unions, on the board of directors ought to be part of good corporate governance. A fourth example, which is particularly relevant, I think, for Australia, deals with the laws governing pensions and other fiduciary laws governing fiduciaries. You're lucky to have a very good pension scheme, and the pension schemes have begun to focus on ESG, environmental sustainable governance issues. But among the issues that they ought to be focusing on is how the corporations that they are investing in are treating their workers. And in the United States, the laws for a long while had the view that if you were a fiduciary or if you were responsible for a pension, you could not consider any of the ESG issues at all, including how workers were treated. You were only supposed to focus on short-term returns. Well, it seems very strange to me that workers, pension funds, should not have a voice in how the companies that they have invested in behave. If you own something, you should have an ability to say something. And it actually, over the long term, companies that behave better, I think, do have higher returns. That goes with the idea I said before that greater equality, greater voice is associated with greater productivity. So it's not as if they're going counter to each other, but short-term maximization is not necessarily consistent with long-term. Short-term leads to higher labor turnover. Workers get demoralized. It's part of the problem why in the United States there's this great resignation that many of you may have heard about. Workers really feel, firms didn't treat their workers very well in the pandemic, and workers don't feel any loyalty to the firm. And that has undermined the ability of the firms. It's one of the sources of the supply problems that are now giving rise to inflation. Well, there still another area where I think greater some reform ought to be is I talked about what I've talked about so far are examples of reforms in what we might call the microeconomics, but they're also macroeconomics. Today, the Treasury in Australia announced a review of the Reserve Bank monetary policy. One question that they ought to be asking is addressing is governance of the RBI. You know, even if you believe in independence, the question is, who is sitting there making these judgments? And some countries have recognized that having a lot of people from, what we would say, Wall Street, from the financial sector, is not representative of all of society. And some countries have actually forbidden people from the financial sector being on their board because they say that distorts decision-making. But some countries have insisted, since one of the obligations of a central bank is to manage the economy in terms of growth and employment, there should be a representative of workers. Sweden, for instance, always has a representative of workers on their central bank. So that I think this is maybe an opportune time to raise this issue about whether in the governance of the central bank of RBI, the Reserve Bank, there should be a representative of workers. Finally, I think it's important to make a more affirmative case for unions of the kind that I've been trying to make this evening. For 40 years, the dominant economic paradigm, policy paradigm, has been neoliberalism. It was a model that believed that there was no power anywhere. There's perfect competition. No firm had any power. No worker had any power. The word power was never used in economics. That was for political science or some other discipline. And economic models based on that notion obviously were not going to provide a good description or a good framework for policy for our actual economy. Well, we've had not only 40 years of neoliberalism in one country, we've had it in many countries. And I think we can say with a fair degree of confidence that that experiment has failed. And it failed to produce growth. Growth was actually lower in the 40 years of neoliberalism than it was before, and for reasons that are can be well understood. But what growth occurred was not shared. It all went to the people at the top. And that's why we wind up in the situation we are with growing inequality, this being the first generation that will be worse off than experience. So there needs to be an understanding that we need a new economic framework, one in which there needs to be a better balance, a greater role for collective action, and an important part of that collective action has to be workers working collectively together through unions. I think that that kind of rethinking where we understand the role, the importance of collective action, unions, government, lots of other forms of collective action, has to be at the center of this reconstruction of the economy. And unions need not only to take a lead in in this kind of collective action that I've described, but also in the advocacy of the change away from neoliberalism and explaining why it is that neoliberalism failed and why we need collective action. And I think this is really imperative if we are going to achieve an economy where the well-being of ordinary citizens are advanced. Thank you.
Colleagues, we're going to move to a Q&A session. And before we start, Professor, I'd just really like to acknowledge your contribution tonight. One of the things that really sort of resonated with me is that I've just come back from the US and I've actually spent time with the Boston Teachers Union and the American Federation of Teachers, and certainly the issues of inequality run deep. You know, that struggle is global because many of the issues that they're facing are issues that we're also facing. But I was also very privileged to hear from the workers who are mobilising within Amazon, the Amazon Workers Union, and also within Starbucks, and you know, that mobilising and building workers' power, which is just so critical. But we've got some questions now from the floor. So I think the first one is going to be presented by Michelle Purdy, who's the Federal TAFE President from our union, the AU, and that's going to be beamed in via video.
In Australia, like America, employers complain all the time about shortages of skilled workers. Yet employers and governments never put enough resources into high quality, accessible vocational education. We have a public vocational system called TAFE that was once the gold standard in the world, but has been undermined by years of austerity and privatisation. Can you discuss why things like training and vocational education are not given the resources they need? And how does the lack of public vocational education hold back productivity, technology, and living standards?
When you had large enterprises like General Motors that were the dominant form, and people stayed with the company for years or a whole lifetime, General Motors could have its own training program and knew that it was the workers that it trained would stay with it. That's not the way a modern economy. You know, people are with a firm for a few years, and so if you don't have public support for training and retraining, you are going to wind up with a less educated labor force, a less skilled labor force than you need for the modern economy. Now, one of the good things is that there are now new technologies using, what they call EdTech, that are able to facilitate some of this training. So while the change in the economy has made it more difficult, more imperative that the government be involved, we have new technologies that may make it more accessible if there's adequate government support. So I really do think this is an important part of, you might say, the benefits that ought to be given to workers.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. We'll now go to Jacob Batt from the AMWU, and I think Jacob hopefully has got a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for that lecture. Obviously, unions in both Australia and America have been attacked for decades now. And you spoke, I think your first point around what it is we need to do now around bargaining systems. Obviously in Australia, we're limited to collective bargaining at individual enterprises. You were referring to other systems like patent bargaining. What is it that, why are we limited to collective bargaining with individual enterprises? And what would be the benefits of introducing bargaining at a broader level?
Well, I mean, in a way, you can see if you're only one enterprise, they'll say if I give you more higher wages, I'm not going to be able to compete with my rivals. And so you're setting everybody competing against each other. And it's undermining the collective nature of the bargaining process. You know, it'd be like, at the other extreme, if you were bargaining just by yourself, you have no bargaining power. And you won't be able to get anything. That's why you have to collectively get together. But if it's only one enterprise, that has a lot less bargaining power than if it's the whole sector. So you can say, you know, I think it's almost obvious that the wider the sector, you know, the wider the framework, the more the workers have a greater bargaining power. But the most telling evidence is the evidence I gave, the fact that employers are resisting it so much. They must believe that it's going to give workers more bargaining power. And, you know, when real wages have done so poorly, I think it's a prima facie case that workers' bargaining power has been eroded.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Professor. We've got another video now from the AMWU, Mitch Best.
Hi, I'm Mitchell Best. I'm a motor mechanic in Hobart, Tasmania. In 2013, Joe Hockey dared GM to leave. Joe Hockey was the Federal Treasurer of the Coalition Government. He said 6 words: "You are here or you're not." In 2017, after nearly 100 years, Australia stopped manufacturing cars. In my experience, the importance of Australian manufacturing has been downplayed for decades. We seem to think that minerals and resources like coal, oil, gas are the main engine of our economy. Dig it up, ship it out. I got sick of hearing Australian economists and politicians telling us that it was the workers' fault. And high wages and union demands made auto manufacturing uncompetitive. But I know that a nation like Germany have car manufacturing industries that are not only competitive, but provide workers with good pay, conditions, and highly skilled jobs. My question to you, sir, is why does manufacturing matter for an advanced economy? And how would a car industry making sustainable electric vehicles pay good wages and conditions and still be competitive? Thank you for your time. I look forward to your reply.
I think manufacturing is an important part of the economy, but it's only a small part, and its role is diminishing. That's just a fact globally and within most countries. In the U.S., manufacturing is about 8-9% of GDP and of employment. The reason for that is very, very simple. It's the success in productivity increases. That we are just like, you know, 100 years ago, or more, a little more than that, the center of the economy was agriculture. People said, how can you have an economy in which you don't have agricultural employment? 70% of the people were employed in agriculture. Well, today it's about 2 or 3%, and they produce more food than even an obese society can consume. So why is that? We've gotten enormous productivity increases in agriculture, and that has enabled people to shift labor into other things, like education, like manufacturing. And so we're going to be going through another thing like that, out of manufacturing into services, like education, the fact that we're living longer, health is going to take more of our income, culture, one of the benefits of leisure, that you don't have to spend all your time getting the basic necessities of life, of food, housing, and clothing, and so forth, is that you have time to do things that are really enjoyable, like reading and writing and art and music and those other things. So I think those are where we will be going, and it will be even more important to have policies that increase productivity in these other sectors. And new technologies will enable, at least in some of the sectors, to have significant increases in productivity. Having said that, obviously we are still very dependent on manufacturing. And I think the pandemic exposed the fact that we have a less resilient economy, that we've become too dependent on imports. The United States couldn't even make simple products like masks or protective gear. So I think it will be important, and there's a lot of learning benefit, technology from those industrial processes. So I think manufacturing is going to continue to be important, but I think it would be foolish to think it will be at the center of our economy. It's not at the center of the economy now. It's only 8, 9%.
Thanks, Professor. And I think that the second part of the question really goes to the electrical car industry as well, and your reflections on how we can ensure that that becomes a sustainable industry in terms of manufacturing.
Well, there are a couple of aspects of that. First, I mean, obviously, whatever is produced, you have to think about the whole life cycle. And if you're producing electric cars, are environmentally sound only if the electricity that is used in the electric cars is produced in a environmentally sound way. So if you are using coal to produce electricity for an electric car, that's really pretty dirty. So you have to look at this systemically. Now, obviously, one of the concerns, increasing concerns, is that some of the minerals that go into the electric car, cobalt, are being mined in ways that are not environmentally sustainable. And I think obviously, this is an area where a lot of research needs to be done to develop ways of batteries that are not so dependent on production that is not environmentally sustainable or is done in a more sustainable way. I think this is actually where some of the focus on neoliberalism has been particularly bad. The focus has all been on getting the price as low as possible in the short run. And we don't include all of the environmental cost in the price. And if we might be able to get much more sustainable production of electric cars if we're willing to pay an extra 5%.
Thank you very much. We've got one final question, so I'll invite Nicole Cownan, Deputy Federal Secretary of the AU.
Thanks, Professor Stiglitz. You touched on it in your address in relation to the US Supreme Court, and in particular the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. It represents a major step backwards for women in the United States and indeed around the world. Here in Australia, women, we know, now make up the majority of union members, and so this issue of reproductive rights and a range of other human and social rights are at the centre of trade union business. What are the economic and labour market consequences of limiting access to human rights, and what are the main economic arguments that we as trade unions must be making to support our work across the community to ensure that all human rights are protected?
Yeah, that's a very good question, we've been thinking a lot about some of the consequences of the reversal of Roe versus Wade, and what it is going to do for, say, women's opportunity if you go to work for a company who has an office in Texas. It's very natural for a woman not to want to go to work in Texas if she's of childbearing age. And that diminishes her opportunities. Does that mean it's going to open up a whole wide range? Or does that mean that if a firm has an established branch, economic activity in Texas, it inevitably has to discriminate against women, because if they keep that branch, that means some of the opportunities within the firm will be closed off to her because of Texas's policy. So that's maybe an example of how the abrogation of rights in one place, in a world of globalization, this is just within America's borders, has implications for how the labor market works in other places. We live in a too integrated world to ignore the violation of human rights. The way I think about this is, a violation of an individual's human rights in any place is violation, in all places. You can't have this selectively. And I think the voice of unions is particularly important in this area. One of the functions, I said, of collective action of unions is voice, and to give voice that otherwise might not be heard. Rupert Murdoch has a way of getting his voice out there. He has lots of newspapers, and that's. But ordinary citizens really don't have much voice, and one of the ways that their voice gets expressed collectively is through the union. And I think the unions have a particularly important role then in articulating the importance of these human rights in all these areas. There are some aspects of human rights which directly affect workers, and where I think the workers' movement, union movements ought to be more vocal, particularly more vocal. For instance, I don't think it's widely known that about 5% of the industrial output in the United States is done by prison labor and paid almost nothing, like 25 cents an hour. That's a violation of any kind of basic human right. And there's some of you may have seen, there's a documentary called the 13th Amendment, because the 13th Amendment to our Constitution is the amendment which freed the slaves and said there can't be involuntary servitude, but they made an exception. And that exception was to those who were in prison. And that had the perverse consequence of inducing a lot of, the huge number of African Americans that went to prison. and the involuntary involuntary servitude that they have in those prisons. So I think the global labor movement ought to be, particularly vocal about this kind of abuse of involuntary servitude that is going on today in America.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, please join me in thanking Professor Joseph Stiglitz for his contributions tonight. Professor, we have a small gift for you, a couple of books for you to read on your journey home or at some stage. So we really appreciate the time that you've taken tonight. It's been a very thought-provoking conversation. Colleagues, as we wrap up, there are a number of thank yous to make. These nights don't just happen by themselves, and so I'd like to acknowledge many of the people that have been involved tonight. Thank you to the funding partners, the ACTU, the AMWU and the AU. Thanks also to the Australian Institute and the Carmichael Centre at the Centre for Future Work. Thanks to RMIT for hosting the event in the gorgeous theatre that we've spent our evening in. I'd also like to say thank you to the Victorian Government and the Department of Education and Training Victoria for sponsoring this event. And wait, there's more. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Carmichael Centre partners Sally McManus and Michelle O'Neill from the ACTU. My name's on here, but I might skip that and acknowledge Kevin Bates from the AU as well, Andrew Detmar and Steve Murphy from the AMWU, and our VIPs that have been in attendance tonight, Professor Alec Cameron from RMIT, Doug Cameron joining us online, Frank Cherry, AMWU, Betty Brent, AMWU, Colin Ormsby, AMWU, John Spate, AMWU, Steve Murphy, AMWU, Bill Kelty, ACTU, Mary Stewart, ACTU, and Laurie Carmichael Jr. Joining us online. Can I also thank the staff, RMIT, Lauren Goethals, Tegan Dixon, Ravi Lama, Kate Tellenkamp, Lauren Hessler and Anthony Forsyth, and from the ACTU, Liam Byrne, Pete McGrath, Francis Leach and Kim Mack, and from the Australia Institute, the Centre for Future Work and the Carmichael Centre, we're almost there, Anna Chang, Hannah Brown, Kathy O'Sullivan, Eleanor Johnston-Leake, Hayden Starr, Jake Wishart, Lily Rains, Fiona McDonald, Jim Stamford, Mark Dean, Ben Oaquist and Ebony Bennett. Let's give them all a big round of applause. And as we finish up tonight, I'd just like to direct your attention to the work of the Centre. And you can see behind us we have a number of banners here. And if you're looking for more information, you can go to the carmichaelcentre.org.au, and we'd love your support for our ongoing work. So thank you very much for your attendance tonight. Thank you once again, Professor Stiglitz. It's been an absolute pleasure, and safe travels home. Good evening, everyone.